Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this edition of Quarantine Collections. I'm going to remember my name today. My name is Travis Gilbert. I'm the Educator and Collections Coordinator here at the Old Baldy Foundation. And we have been doing virtual programming during these quarantine to bring you a little bit of history, sometimes a little bit of levity, in a very serious situation. So we hope that your family is safe. We hope that you all are healthy during these trying times. And we thank all our first responders, all our medical personnel, our essential employees like those stocking the grocery store here on Bald Head Island and in your communities out there. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for everything you're doing to get our nation through this terrible pandemic. So let's spend a few minutes. Let's forget about that pandemic. Let's talk some history. I noticed this morning it's kind of two major Civil War events, one local and one national. Their anniversaries are today. First being is today is the day that General Robert E. Lee up in Virginia, evacuated Petersburg and Richmond. Richmond being the capital of the Confederacy. So today really marks the beginning of the final chapter of the Confederate States of America. Once Robert E. Lee evacuates Richmond, it only takes a few days for him to surrender at Appomattox Courthouse. And then the anniversary for the local event is today is the day that Confederates tried to blow up Cape Lookout Lighthouse, about 2 hours north of us along the coast in a little town called Beaufort. Today it is now part of Cape Lookout National Seashore. Yeah, you got that right. The Confederates, terrorists, domestic terrorists, I guess if you want to call them, they tried to blow up Cape Lookout Lighthouse. Now there were two lighthouses up there. One was built in 1812 and it was left standing, and another one was built in 1859, and that's the current lighthouse that y'all are familiar with today, with the black and white diamonds. Well, the Union Army and Navy had captured Beaufort in 1862, roughly a year into the war. So they had control of that town and that port throughout the remainder of the war. And local Confederate sympathizers had attempted to blow up that lighthouse, to demolish the lighthouse in order to impede the Union Army and Navy's ability to navigate those shoal waters and that trying to get over the bar and into the port of Wilmington. Well, it didn't go so very well. They did do a little bit of damage. They damaged some of the iron staircase. They damaged some of the oil supply, but it did not take long for the Union engineers to fix up Cape Lookout Lighthouse and get her working again as a navigational aid for the Union Army and Navy coming in and out of Beaufort. So in honor of kind of those two anniversaries, I thought that we would talk a little bit of Civil War today, or this morning during this quarantine collections. So folks, if you're listening out there, we have quite a few listeners. Thank you for joining us. Give us a shout out in those comments. Let us know where you're listening from. Let us know what your connection to Bald Head Island is. And of course, if you have any questions, throw them in those comments. We'll get an answer for you. Let's see what's going on here. Hey, good morning, Kathy. Good morning, Patty. Helen. Thank you, too, for continuing to give us a great history lesson in the history of Bald Head Island. Of course, Helen, it's my pleasure. It keeps us busy down here on Bald Head. And, hey, good morning, McCallie. So, again, if you're listening out there, give us a shout-out. We'd love to hear from you. So, what I've pulled out behind me here, and we'll have to move the camera in order for you all to see, is one of our maps from the collections. We have a significant number of maps, nautical charts, military maps, plat maps, locator maps. If you've ever visited Bald Head Island, you know that You need a locator map. Everything kind of looks the same when you get here to Baldy Island, so a map is a little important in trying to navigate your way through the forest and the dunes. Well, shortly after the Union Army and Navy capture Fort Holmes, that Civil War fort that was constructed on Baldy Island between 1863 and 1865, David Porter, who's in charge of the naval forces, he's an admiral for the Union or for the North, he sends an engineer to Smith Island, known as Baldy Island, and several other of the barrier islands and forts in the lower Cape Fear region after they are captured by the Union Army and Union Navy. What the purpose of sending an engineer to these forts is kind of twofold in Admiral David Porter's mind. First of all, there's always these jealousies between the Navy and the Army. If you're a sports fan, you know that every year the Army-Navy game is kind of a big deal. West Point versus Annapolis. I went to college near Annapolis. We're always Navy fans from my background. But there's, even to today, there's in sports or in conflict, there's always this tension, this jealousy, this rivalry between the Army and the Navy. So the first purpose for Admiral David Porter in sending an engineer to Fort Holmes after they capture Baldy Island is to prove to the bureaucrats, to the elected officials up in Washington, D.C., that the Navy had an essential role in capturing the Port of Wilmington at the conclusion of the Civil War. If the Navy can send an engineer onto these fortifications previously constructed by the Confederates, they can detail the firepower that the Union Navy was up against in trying to capture these forts. Remember from a previous episode that we're not talking about small cannons, field cannons, if you will, on those two round wheels that are used on battlefields that you see today at Gettysburg or Antietam, pulled around on horses. They might be firing, a 12-pound cannonball. No. We are talking about at Fort Holmes massive cannons. The smallest being 24-pound cannonballs to 32-pound cannonballs to we're going up into near hundreds of pound cannonballs that have ranges from 1 mile to 3 miles. These are massive pieces of artillery that the Union Army and the Union Navy were up against. So if Admiral Porter can send an engineer to Fort Holmes and detail the firepower in this fort that can prove to the bureaucrats, to the politicians, to the public up north, wow. Can you imagine what the Union Navy was up against? And yet they still captured this fort. Remarkable. Now, the second reason that Admiral Porter would send an engineer to Fort Holmes after its capture by Union Army and Union Navy forces is to learn what did the Confederates achieve here in the forts of the lower Cape Fear, and how may we apply those lessons in future wars and in future conflicts. Are there engineering feats that the Confederates accomplished here that we can apply in fortifications that may be built in the future? So kind of twofold, to prove what the Union Navy had achieved and to learn from the Confederate successes, the engineering feats that were accomplished on barrier islands like Baldy Island. So it didn't take very long. The map I'm going to show you here in a minute is based off of a map that was created in January and in February of 1865. Remember, the Second Battle of Fort Fisher, which is the leading cause to the Port of Wilmington falling, finished up by January 15th, 1865. So this map that I'm about ready to show you is based on details and observations that occurred less than a month after the Port of Wilmington fell. That's how immediate how immediately Admiral Porter had thought, hey, we need to get somebody over there to detail what was going on. So the map was created, first of all, the observations were created by a U.S. engineer called John Bradford. John Bradford was aboard the naval forces that were helping the Army capture the port of Wilmington. He went ashore on Bald Head Island roughly in late January of 1865, and he started detailing these fortifications, these batteries, these cannons, the magazines. You know, recall magazines are man-made caves that were built to store ammunition. And he created this map that was hand-drawn, that the map I'm going to show you was based off of. So as soon as John Bradford creates his hand-sketched map of Fort Holmes, he sends it to David Porter, who is the admiral, and David Porter immediately sends it to Secretary Gideon Welles, who is the Navy Secretary up in Washington, D.C. And of course, they are going to take John Bradford's hand-sketched map that he created on the field here in Bald Head Island and produce a copy, an official copy of that map. And that is the official copy I'm going to show you. It ends up appearing in the atlas to accompany the official records of the Union and Confederate armies. To us Civil War nuts, that is just, we shorten that whole title to just the official records. So in the decades following the American Civil War, Congress commissions this official record to be consolidated. They're going to take all the official battle records from the Confederacy and all the official battle records from the Union, and they're going to consolidate them into an official record and publish that out so folks, civilians, veterans, future generations can learn what actually happened during the American Civil War. And to accompany those official records, of course, they're going to create an atlas. If you've ever tried to read a dialogue or to read a narrative about a battle, it's usually important to have a map right beside you. It makes learning what they're talking about in the narrative much easier when you have a battle map right by your side. So again, to recap, Admiral David Porter captures Bald Head Island with his with his Union Army and Navy counterparts. He sends an engineer, John Bradford, to Bald Head Island. John Bradford observes in late January what occurred here under the Confederate dominion on Bald Head Island when they were constructing Fort Holmes. John Bradford creates this hand-sketched map. He sends it back to Admiral Porter. Admiral Porter sends it back up to Washington, D.C., to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. And Secretary Welles commissions this official map based on John Bradford's hand-sketched drawings. And it is that map that appears in the atlas that accompanies the official records of the Union and Confederate Navy and Army during the decades following the American Civil War. So if you're listening out there, give us a shout out in the comments. Let us know where you're listening from. Let us know what your connection to Bald Head Island is. And if you have any questions, I'm going to pull out the map here. If you have any questions as we go along, let us know what those connections are or what those questions are in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. So on that note, I'm going to pull out this map here. All right, so this is what the map looks like. And you can see there are several different maps. Again, this appeared in the official atlas. You can see it up here. The atlas to accompany the official records of the Union and Confederate armies, 1861 to 1865. Now, this first map here on the left, that shows you all the different fortifications found in the Cape Fear River. So, of course, Bald Head Island is here down where that Cape Fear River dumps out into the Atlantic Ocean. And this inlet right here, that is called Old Inlet. That is what you pass on the ferry. Recall there was a second inlet that was used during the American Civil War called New Inlet. You can see New Inlet there. Bald Head Island is sandwiched right in between Old Inlet and New Inlet. Now, of course, Bald Head is labeled as Smith Island here. And you have the Bald Head, just a section on the southwestern corner of Smith's Island. And you can see those red lines create Fort Holmes. Curious enough, there is in the Maritime Forest there, that red lettering says Artillery Road. There was a road that predates Federal Island, that predates Federal Road, that was constructed from the western part of the island to the eastern part of the island at Cape Fear. And that was used by the Edenton Bell Battery and several other artillerymen to move cannons that were mobile up and down the beach to take shots at the Union Navy and blockading forces off of the island. Now, what is really great about this left-hand map, it shows you all the other sister fortifications constructed by Confederates in the Cape Fear River that worked with Fort Holmes to protect the Port of Wilmington. So directly across from Fort Holmes on Bald Head Island is, of course, modern-day Oak Island. And on Oak Island was Fort Caswell, which dates, it was begun in 1825. And you can see Fort Caswell right there labeled. Fort Caswell is a fort that predates the Civil War. It was called the third system of fortifications. Its sisters are like Fort Macon up in Beaufort, which is a lovely state historic site today. Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Fort Pulaski down in Savannah. And several other forts, like Fort Jefferson down in Key West. Many of you have visited third system forts and may not even know. They are very, very common. Now, in addition to Fort Caswell being constructed, to the west, they built two other forts, Fort Campbell and Fort Shaw. And these were forts that did not exist before the Civil War. They were constructed in order to assist Fort Caswell on Oak Island to protect that old inlet. Now, the other fort that was constructed before the Civil War was Fort Pender there. You see Smithville is labeled, that is Southport. Recall that Southport changed its name from Smithville to Southport in the late 19th century in order to attract a railroad. Well, before there was even Smithville, there was a fort called Fort Johnston. It was begun in the colonial days around 1745. So, of course, it existed there during the Civil War. Predates the Civil War just like Fort Caswell. Except the Confederates renamed it Fort Pender after a Confederate general that was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg in July of 1863. Curious enough, if you recall, if you've ever visited Bald Head Island, right when you're leaving Deep Point Marina, there's an abandoned lighthouse. See, it's labeled right there. It's actually a range light, a system of lights, harbor lights that went up and down the Cape Fear River, constructed in the 1850s. That lighthouse was used as a signal station, using semaphore flags for the Confederates during the Civil War. And directly across is called Price's Creek Lighthouse today. Now, that other inlet called New Inlet, again, this is Bald Head Island right here. This is East Beach. This is closed up today by the rocks, that man-made dam. The most famous of the forts is called Fort Fisher, protecting that new inlet, a state historic site today. And directly across from Fort Fisher was a small fortification called Fort Lamb. Now, the other fort that is pretty well known today was in Old Brunswick. Old Brunswick is the colonial port for Wilmington, established in the 1720s, predates Wilmington. It was burned by the British in 1776. We talked about that yesterday morning. Well, in that old ruins of that old colonial port, the Confederates had built Fort Anderson, named after another Confederate general that lost his life, whose home was in North Carolina. And then as you move northward 30 miles, eventually you're going to get to the port of Wilmington. And you can see through those red lines all kinds of fortifications that protected Wilmington during the Civil War. So that's an overview of all the fortifications lining 30 miles of Cape Fear River. The Bradford map we were discussing in detail for Fort Holmes is right here. You can see a line of rebel works on Smith Island. You can see David Porter's name is there. And right here is the handwritten sketch. It says, Engineer Comstock. That is who forwarded, he was an aide-de-camp basically to David Porter, and he forwarded that to Washington, D.C. So again, on Fort Holmes, there were 5 batteries. You have Battery Holmes, the largest of them all. You move up to battery number 1. Battery number 2, battery number 3. We explored the ruins of battery number 3 during a previous episode. Battery number 3 faces east. It is today around like Gunnery Court and Fort Holmes Trail. The 3 previous batteries I just showed you are now underwater. They have eroded due to the erosion of south and west beaches. And there is battery number 4, which is located just down the street from the lighthouse next to the Bald Head Association's building. You can see that there were 2 24-pounder cannons and 2 32-pounder cannons. And that magazine is still there. That magazine pointed out right there. You can still see that today just down the street from the lighthouse. You can see the lighthouse is labeled there. These red lines here around the battery show you that not only was the western end of Bald Head Island clear cut, but they sharpened the felled logs and put them in the ground facing the enemy. And that was to slow the enemy down if they were ever to charge the ramparts or the walls of Fort Holmes. We also have examples of the Union Navy observing basically controlled burns. They also burned some of the brush here on Bald Head Island. Again, why would they do that? Well, they want a clear line of fire. It'd be terrible if that 24-pounder cannonball would hit a tree rather than the enemy. So you want to clear cut miles around your fort so you have a clear line of fire. And we discussed in a previous episode at battery number 4, it has that crescent shape or a C, an inverted C, because they want an enfilading line of fire. Meaning that if you were this cannon right here, you could fire down the length of an opposing enemy. The enemy is lined up and coming along. you could fire down the length of my finger rather than perpendicular to my finger. Firing down the length of a line is going to unfortunately harm more soldiers than you would firing perpendicular to that line. So that is why battery number 4 sticks way out in that crescent shape. It's an enfilading line of fire. And then you can see Confederate road there. It says road to upper end of island, which means the Cape or the modern day Shoals Club. In a future episode, we'll talk about the quarters. We know where those quarters were. You can see that those were delineated there. And it's important to know, and it says right here, the curtain is unfinished. The curtain is another word for the fort's wall. So the fort was unfinished. It was unfinished by the time the Union Army and Navy captured Bald Head Island. It was always a work in progress for the Confederates. So again, this is based on John Bradford's map created in the late January 1865, forwarded by David Porter and his aide-de-camp there, that lieutenant colonel, to Washington, D.C. to create this official map that appeared in the decades following the Civil War in that atlas to accompany the official records. And not only does Fort Holmes in detail appear, but other forts as well. You can see there is Fort Caswell, that third system fort that was built before the American Civil War and adapted. That is there now. That is a Baptist camp. The Baptist Assembly in North Carolina owns that portion of Oak Island. So a lot of folks go to summer camp there. Perhaps you have gone to summer camp. That is where our local Civil War roundtable meets. And that was assisted on Oak Island by a fort that was built by the Confederates called Fort Campbell. And then here is a detail of Fort Johnston, again built in downtown Southport, predating the Civil War, and renamed Fort Pender during the Civil War by the Confederates. You can see it had several 10-inch Columbiads, which were monstrous pieces of artillery. So I hope that gives you a better idea of what Fort Holmes looked like. Were the Union Army and Navy impressed with what they saw in creating that map? They certainly were. That admiral in the Navy, I just want to read a quote by how impressed he was. He says, quote, "They are certainly the most formidable and best built earthworks I ever saw, and do credit to the engineer who planned them. One would suppose the whole Southern Confederacy had been at work throwing up mud and sand. The Confederates have covered masonry of Fort Caswell with thick earth on the outside and made it almost impervious to shot and shell. All our works shall be earthworks, or those that are built be covered with earth." That is how impressed Admiral Porter was with what he observed through his engineers here at Fort Holmes on Bald Head Island and at Fort Caswell across the river from Bald Head Island on what is now Oak Island today. So on that note, hey, good morning, Mackie. It's good to see you. So on that note, folks, I also wanted to point out here, this is what the hand-drawn sketch looked like of that map, created by John Bradford, and forwarded to Washington, D.C. to create the official version that I showed you today. So there are two other versions of the map, one created after the American Civil War, and one created by the Confederates during the Civil War, before the Confederates surrendered. So these three versions of the map are why historians over the years, including into the today, are still indecisive about where the ruins are and where the fort was on the modern footprint of Bald Head Island today. All three maps, the one I showed you today, the Bradford map we'll call it, or the Comstock map, the previous Confederate map, and the later U.S. Army Corps of Engineers map, all three don't quite line up. You know, if you place all three on top of one another, on top of the modern footprint with all the roads and the houses today on Baldy Island, they just don't quite line up. So there are different camps, and we find this in history, but there are different camps. Different historians subscribe to different maps, or sometimes I find, and including myself, we like to pick and choose. We almost cherry pick which parts of the three different maps we like and which parts we're going to selectively forget or ignore. But if you're very interested in learning more about these three different maps, I'm not sure if we'll get to the other two, but I have a hunch we will. If you're interested in learning more about the three different maps and how historians have used those three different maps to find the current footprint of Baldy Island, I encourage you to go online. On the October 2006 edition of the North Carolina Historical Review, Dr. Jack Goree published a academic article called Mapping Fort Holmes, A Search for Confederate Ruins at Baldy Island by Dr. Jack Goree. And he discusses in detail how these three different maps were created, and then elaborates on how he uses those three different maps to come up with his conclusions on which ruins on Baldy Island are part of Fort Holmes, which are later additions through development or construction on the golf course, and how he kind of rationalizes his academic conclusions. You can find that again online if you just Google Dr. Jack Goree and mapping Fort Holmes on Baldy Island. So this afternoon, folks, we're going to be bringing you, and Patty, I appreciate your enthusiasm. Well, I'm very enthusiastic about the Civil War. So this afternoon, we're going to be bringing you another edition of Touring with Travis, so please join us this afternoon. Tomorrow we'll be bringing you again at 10 a.m. another edition of Quarantine Collections. We'll move away from the military history. Today we talked about the Civil War, and yesterday we kind of talked about the American Revolution. So I promise that we'll bring you something that has nothing to do with military history. We'll go back to the Lighthouse Service, or back to archaeology, or the life-saving service, some of these other themes pertaining to the story of Baldy Island. I encourage you to go onto our brand new website, oldbaldy.org. There you'll find information about our April 8th virtual historic happy hour. We're going to be joining you all via camera from wherever you are listening from with your libation of choice, and we'll be discussing the history and the memory of the boathouse that this island lost due to Hurricane Florence in the fall of 2018. Tickets typically for happy hours are $15 when we host them here at the Lighthouse. We're going to be doing this virtually free, meaning that if you go on our website and sign up for our newsletter, you will find a free code to sign up for that historic happy hour. But if you'd like to drop us a donation, we very much appreciate your generosity and your support during these trying times. Additionally, on that new website, you will find our brand new online store, all kinds of puzzles and books and apparel and gifts. Easter's coming up. I know I have an Easter basket to put together for my goddaughter, so all kinds of great things in terms of the upcoming holiday that unfortunately we're all going to have to spend isolated, but that does not mean that we can't celebrate and virtually be together. That's what I'm planning to do with my goddaughter. So I hope that y'all are still excited if you celebrate Easter or any other holiday around April. So go on our online store, throw us some support. All those funds go back to our mission of preserving and interpreting North Carolina's oldest standing lighthouse. So again, folks, thank you for joining us. You can find previous editions of this Quarantine Collections or any other virtual programming
on our Facebook page, on Instagram TV, or also if you go to our YouTube channel. And when you visit our YouTube channel, hit subscribe for us. Help us grow our social media presence. So I hope to see you at a next edition of our virtual programming, or perhaps at that virtual historic happy hour coming up. I hope your family is safe. I hope you're healthy. To all our essential employees and first responders and medical personnel, thank you for what you are doing to help our nation through these trying times. And folks, we'll see you at a future edition. Thank you for joining in.